on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The draft opinion from Samuel Alito and the news that it's almost inevitable that a majority of the Supreme Court will vote to overturn Roe versus Wade is a historical moment that is comprised of many elements. Among them, of course, the utter rapacity of the conservative movement and the Republican Christian right to dominate our politics at any cost, despite the unpopularity of their opinions. And of course, so many other things we could talk about and have been talking about on this program. But among other things, it is also a fascinating, if frightening, glimpse into the cultural history of this country, of our society, of our gender relationships. And here to talk about that with us now is our good friend, Lynn Parramore. Lynn is an author and cultural historian. She has written about the role of women in our culture. She recently interviewed a historian about the role of abortion drugs in ancient economies. She's been thinking about this issue for a long time. So first of all, Lynn Parramore, welcome back to the program.
Delighted to be with you, as always.
And delighted to have you, as always. So I will start with an admittedly not very intellectual sounding question, but did this ruling, when it came out, blow your mind as it blew so many others? Or I mean, I felt like on the one hand, I expected it, but on the other hand, it was still staggering. Yeah. So what was your reaction when this thing was released?
I felt much the same. As much as we knew that the writing was on the wall, to actually see it in reality and see Alito's really deranged writing on the subject right there in print was just horrifying and dumbfounding, especially when, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about history today. It felt like we'd just taken a leap backwards. That I mentioned in something I wrote recently. History does not move in linear progress. Progress doesn't move in a linear fashion. We regress all the time, and we're doing it big time on this issue.
We really are. And, I felt to a certain extent like this opinion was the scene in the horror movie where, like, the stepdad or whatever and I don't want to knock stepdads, but I mean, there's stepfather horror movie, whoever it is, the stepmom, the stepdad, the friendly neighbor suddenly reveals themselves to be like fanatical and insane. And they're the third act where they're chasing you around the house with an axe. I feel, all these people went before, all these justices went before the Senate and said, Roe is established law, and we believe in stare decisis, that we wouldn't overturn an established law. And not only did they then do it, but they basically said every crazy thing you've ever thought we think, we do think.
That's right. Using precedent from legal minds that were persecuting women for witchcraft. You just can't make this stuff up. It does sound like something from a horror movie. And, I realized in some of the research that I've done, saying that, Alito's opinions come out of the Dark Ages is actually unkind and unfair to the Dark Ages, because even in the Dark Ages, many ordinary women had access to family planning to a greater extent that they do some places right here in the U.S.
Well, I want to talk about that because it's extremely interesting, and because I'm afraid I was unfair, at least in my own thoughts, to the Dark Ages as well, because this ruling, when I wasn't reeling from shock, made me think of Steve Martin used to play an old character on Saturday Night Live called Theodoric of York, medieval barber, and he would do surgery and all that stuff that barbers used to do. And I thought, oh my God, this is the legal version of Theodoric of York, but I was being unfair, as Steve Martin was probably being unfair. So tell us about that. Tell us, because this is a fascinating, little known, I mean, I think, the conservative trope is that women were always obligated to bear babies. I think the liberal trope is more often than not well, thanks to the miracle of modern medicine, we're not enslaved as women to our bodies anymore. But really, neither side fully reflects the reality, right?
That's really true. And I myself wasn't aware of it until I really started diving into the history. I guess I had always known that women did try various things to terminate pregnancies and to manage their fertility. It didn't surprise me that women had tried. What surprised me in the research that I've done is to find out that it actually worked. And that women regularly could use all kinds of abortifacient drugs, as they're called, various kinds of plants and botanicals that could be used to induce abortion. I didn't realize that they actually worked. And I spoke to a historian named John Riddle, who has done quite a bit of work on this. He wrote a book called Eve's Herbs back in the 90s and explored this subject. It goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. In fact, his work reveals that in the ancient Greek economy, there was a particular city called Cyrene, which is in what's now Libya. The whole economy was based on an abortifacient plant called silphium, as it was known. And it was so popular that it was actually over-harvested out of to the point of extinction, so popular among the Greeks and the Romans. And there are various ways that we know that these drugs were efficacious. I mean, one being the fact that they wouldn't have been so popular unless there was actually some efficacy. But another is that there have been studies done, modern pharmacological studies, that show that various kinds of plants and botanical preparations do indeed intervene in pregnancies, whether it's suppressing hormones or increasing their activity or causing contractions. There are a number of ways it could happen. And it used to be that specialists in botanical medicine, often midwives, what we think of as midwives or wise women as they were called, had very, very detailed knowledge of exactly how to make these preparations. Now, they're not easy preparations to make. You get the wrong dosage, or you harvest the plant at the wrong time, or you extract the medicine the wrong way, and it could be toxic. So they really knew what they were doing from careful observation. And one of the ways that that ancient people figured out that there were drugs that could do these things is they watched their livestock. Their livestock might be nibbling on certain plants, and then they saw that the birth rate would go down. They wouldn't, the cows wouldn't have as many calves. So over observation, they realized, oh, there are plants that can reduce the number of children that women have too. And so they refined this knowledge. It was often passed down by word of mouth, but not always. Sometimes it was passed down in written texts. And there's been a lot of misunderstanding about this. I'll just give you one quick example. A lot of conservatives will yammer on about the Hippocratic Oath and say, oh, the Hippocratic Oath says that you can't do abortions. Well, that's actually not true. What we know of as the Hippocratic Oath said it has a prohibition against using pessaries for abortions. And these would be preparations inserted into the vagina. The reason that those pessaries were prohibited is not for any moral reasons. It's because they were dangerous. They could cause ulcerations. They didn't work very well. But a lot of translators from later ages didn't understand this distinction and just turned the translation into a prohibition on all abortions and added a kind of moral flavor to it, which was never there in the beginning. Not to mention the fact that the Hippocratic Oath wasn't even an oath that physicians took in antiquity. That's a relatively modern invention. And
the Hippocratic Oath also, the primary directive is first do no harm. So if there is a form of inducing abortion that causes harm, then by definition, you're violating the Hippocratic Oath to administer it because you're harming your patient, not because, right. One of the things that fascinated me was in your article in Parramore was the fact that they noticed from observation of livestock, which plants reduced birth rates and that sort of thing. And, at first I had kind of, they didn't have anything else to do but watch the cows, right? So, but actually it's it was their livelihood.
That's right.
They depended on their economy, such as it was based on the value largely of animals and crops. And so it affected their financial well-being if their cows were not producing offspring.
That's right. That's exactly right. They and the average person walking around in ancient Greece knew a lot more about plants that were growing around their home, and in their community than we do. They just, that their observation, as you say, was related to, matters of survival. And they also knew that controlling family size was a matter of survival. They understood that planning the size of a family was essential to the well-being of the mother, the well-being of the family, the economic prosperity of the family. I mean, in times of famine or other kinds of catastrophes, the survival would depend on limiting the number of children. And demographers had debated about this point because obviously people in ancient societies were not collecting detailed demographic records. Right. But it does seem that when you look at the maintenance of population size, let's say in times of economic prosperity, that there must have been family planning to account for the fact that, let's say, Roman women tended to only have, 2 or 3 children per family rather than the number that they would have to have if they were, just having children
without contraception or abortion.
Without contraception or abortion, having them every year or so. So they were doing something, and it's probably not the case that they were just withholding sex. I mean, I think that people understand that's a very unlikely scenario.
Yeah, yes, and one of the things that struck me too about the history of this was that it was not only, as you said, passed by word of mouth, but sometimes in written form. And then your article says, including a text by a 13th century physician, Peter of Spain, who later became Pope John the 21st. So apparently there was no Catholic doctrine against abortion at this time, or at least I inferred that from this interesting fact. Is that true?
The attitudes were a little bit all over the place. So coming out of the ancient world, in Greece to some extent and in Rome to a greater extent, there were varying opinions about abortion. And frankly, abortion did make some people nervous, mainly men who were thinking of a woman's body as property and thinking of the contents of the woman's womb as property. So there was a push to outlaw abortion in some cases in which a woman, let's say, didn't ask the permission of her husband. So there was always that tension about male property rights in patriarchal society. So it's not like abortion was just, totally fine and everyone was cool with it. There was some tension about it. But the idea of when the soul entered the body and all of this kind of thing, that really kind of got going with the Christians and the Christian church. And they started debating about, and some of the debates were, not scientific by any stretch of the imagination, because there was a belief among early church fathers in some cases that the soul entered the male fetus long before it would enter the female fetus, all kinds of nonsense. But the Christians tended to add
well, he's got to start earning a living, I mean, no, I'm sorry.
Living. So there were church fathers who varied in their opinions on abortion. But there was generally an attitude that until the moment of quickening, which was the time in which the woman sensed that the baby was moving in her body. And the only way you would know that is by asking the woman, right? She was the one who determined when the pregnancy was actually official. That anything that happened prior to that was at most a lesser problem or a lesser crime, if you will, in the cases where people were trying to, bishops and so on were trying to outlaw it. But it's interesting because you kind of have these two tracks. You have the church fathers and the bishops arguing about exactly at what point the soul enters the fetus, etc. But then you have ordinary people just going about their business and doing family planning just as they had always done. And even when they tried to criminalize abortion in the Middle Ages, juries routinely refused to convict women. They just wouldn't do it.
What would the charge be? In other words, we're seeing now a resurgence of anti-abortion laws in this country, and to speak to a lot of anti-abortion advocates, they consider it murder, morally indistinguishable from, if you killed me, it doesn't matter, it's murder. And yet the laws that are being promulgated now are not identical to murder laws as we understand them, right? So it's still criminalization. I still oppose it, but it's a little bit different. In let's say in the medieval times, would the charge be murder? Would the charge be something else?
It would usually be something else, a much more minor kind of charge. There were some cases in which a homicide charge was attempted, but again, juries would find all kinds of excuses not to do a conviction. And usually it wasn't against the woman herself. It was, let's say, against a person who had beaten the woman and caused a pregnancy to terminate, a miscarriage or something like that. The idea that an unborn fetus had the same status or rights as a live human being was not a common perception at all. Now, as we get towards the early modern period, you do get more activity around and interest in the idea of really criminalizing abortion, criminalizing women. And it's really interesting.
And when would that be, Lynn? What time frame are we talking about?
Yeah. We're sort of talking about, by the time you get to the 16th century, 17th century, you begin to see these, witch persecutions en masse. And it really is interesting because I didn't quite realize this connection until I started diving into this. Just going after midwives, for example, on the part of bishops and so on, wasn't working very well because these women were trusted parts of the community. They were advising not just on family planning, but all kinds of medical issues. And, it was hard to discredit them. Now, there were two groups of male health practitioners that began to compete with them. One was apothecaries. The apothecaries were male and they did not let women into their ranks. So they began to compete with the midwives for business. And they would prescribe abortifacients and contraceptives, but they knew less about these drugs. And in some cases, that they weren't as efficacious in their treatments. And also, they would prescribe, in many cases, more complicated treatments with more kind of exotic drugs that had to be imported. Obviously, they were trying to make money, right? That was the business model. And they didn't like the idea of the community, the village midwife saying, here, I have a preparation of local herbs that you can take inexpensively. And then physicians, as they begin to get trained in universities, they also begin to compete with these other kinds of healthcare practitioners for business. And they knew even less about contraceptives and abortifacients. The knowledge of how to use those plants for these purposes was not widely taught, although some physicians knew how to do it. And as prohibitions began to increase, they would talk about abortion or write about it in in euphemistic terms. They would say, oh, I have a treatment to bring down the courses or to air the womb or some such language. But women knew exactly what they were talking about.
It all seems, among other things, it's fascinating in Parramore to me and for multiple reasons. But one of them is that, the apothecaries and then the physicians, of course, the primary difference between them and the midwives was that they did not inhabit a woman's body, right? So I would assume also in their treatment, there was a kind of patriarchal, this is what's best for you, and a lack of understanding of either a difficulty of administering a treatment or the physical reaction to a treatment, whereas a midwife could talk as one woman to another about how is this making you feel, how soon can you return to an active sex life, or whatever else may be a confidential issue. These would be things that I would think in that era, even more so than now, a woman would not discuss with a man. So the care provided by men might not only be more costly and extensive, but perhaps also less compassionate and less tuned to the needs of a woman in this situation.
Absolutely. And as prohibitions increased and as midwives were persecuted, I mean, the persecution of witches, the number of women who were actually midwives or wise women, women who dealt with herbs and plants, it was a very high percentage of people persecuted for witchcraft. So the association between women who were perceived by the church as having control over fertility, that increasingly became a threat in the minds of the Christian, elite and the Christian patriarchy. They did not like these women controlling reproduction, and they were going to go after them. So you might not be able to discredit them as practitioners of medicine if you threw a witchcraft charge on them and you got everybody worked up about the idea that they were blighting crops and
Right.
sending demons to terrorize your neighbor. Then you could deal with the midwifery business without acknowledging that that's what you were doing. So the witch persecutions put midwives out of business and terrorized them and made it, impossible for them to work. And there are a couple of demographers whose research suggested that in areas where midwives were heavily persecuted as witches, the population went up.
Interesting. Yeah.
And was being interrupted.
Yes. I mean, I was thinking about witches because you and I have talked about witches before. And, I'm interested in the history of persecution of women as witches. And it strikes me also that even when midwives particularly may or may not have been signaled out to be condemned for witchcraft, if you think about the accusations behind witchcraft trials, for example, Goody Johnson, my cows stopped giving milk, right? I mean, they're all kind of procreative related. They're all kind of body related. The cows stopped giving milk. She appeared as a seductress outside my bedroom window and wanted to, have carnal knowledge of me, whatever it might be, that they're all, not all of them, but that many of them are involved with fertility, with crops, with renewal, with desire. And it seems to me that the through line here, as much as anything else, and, of course, one of the side effects is denial of, abortion rights in early societies. But one of the through lines here is fear of the physical, the embodied woman as being.
Absolutely. And the link between witch persecution and the specific issue of fertility and abortion is it's a very strong link, because how are witches portrayed in the early modern period and late Middle Ages? They're associated with infanticide. They're feeding on babies. There's a lot of imagery around the bad things that they do to babies. That is directly related to the activity of midwives in family planning and a desire to cast them as enemies to the family and even enemies of the state, because some in patriarchal culture, some elites hold that the greater the population, the better it is for the state, even though that's not entirely the case. And often limiting the family size is going to increase prosperity. But anyway, that was the belief that, women should be cranking out babies, and anything that interfered with that, or anyone that interfered with that, was the enemy. And so really to make women into devils because they were involved in family planning was a huge element in witch persecution. And I didn't realize how strong that link was. I started looking back at, woodcuts and things. And throwing babies into a cauldron and throwing babies onto a fire was a big theme to link women with the killing of babies.
And, the production, if you believe that the woman's primary role is to generate babies and then care for them, then the ultimate sin, the ultimate violation against the order of things is for a woman to instead destroy babies, harm babies, reject babies. So, it all seems to tie together frighteningly. And to bring it back to current events, that striking phrase in Alito's batshit, sorry, Troy's going to have to edit that out later, opinion about ensuring the continued domestic supply of infants. It seems to me, you remember? Domestic supply of infants, I believe is the phrase he used.
All these ancient themes, reverberating. Let's
including, excuse me for interrupting, Lynn, but including tribalism / racism. Because when you add the word domestic, you're saying, we don't want black babies. We don't want Muslim babies. We don't want babies from parts of the world where people don't look like Samuel Alito and his family, right? So we want to force women to produce, I mean, yes, as a side effect, black and brown women will also have to produce more children, but the real goal here, I think, he's tipped his hand, white babies. Babies to protect us from the hordes of immigrants and, am I reading too much into it?
No, I think that is definitely true. And we have seen this in many authoritarian moments and regimes in human histories. I mean, God knows the Nazis were into women producing Aryan babies. It's a common thing. And, this idea that one thing that comes up over and over in history is an anxiety on the part of the patriarchy that mothers are having abortions, not, as they might put it, loose women having babies outside of marriage. It drove them crazy that mothers were doing this. A mom who already had 2 children, or a mom who wanted to simply space her children apart, not have a baby every year, but have one maybe every 2 or 3 years. It drove them bonkers that mothers would do this. And yes, the attempt to force them to crank out babies for the state and really appropriate their womb for state use is a common theme here. And we definitely see it in Alito's deranged tract.
So I guess I would end with this, Lynn. At various times during the reproductive rights debate, women, I consider myself an ally to, will bring up something like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, right? And say that is, a vision of the future. And me being like overly analytical, I've always said I empathize with the pain that causes them to say that. It didn't really resonate with me as a complete analogy for what we're, I think what we're dealing with here in terms of patriarchy and religious totalitarianism is a little more insidious and subtle than that. But what are we looking at? If these people are able to, do you have any thoughts on what they are working night and day, decade in and decade out for some kind of society that is not like the one we live in now? Do you have any vision of what that dystopia looks like in their minds?
It's authoritarian. I call this authoritarian creep. If they're able to do this to women, they're not going to stop there. And it's sort of like what Yeats said in the poem, right? The worst are filled with passionate intent.
Exactly. Yeah.
They are fixed on this goal. And unless we meet them with a similar intensity, they're going to just keep right on going. And women's bodies are always linked to authoritarianism. We're both a kind of chip that's used to attract evangelicals. Conservatives will use, we're going to go after abortion, get the evangelicals on our side. And then they also use it, as a way to push the envelope. If we can outlaw abortion, wow, what other freedoms can we take away? When we can take away the freedom, this most basic freedom that's been recognized, since ancient times as kind of fundamental. And we drive women underground and we make it dangerous. These prohibitions that began to emerge in the late modern period, the early modern period, and then it kind of went into abeyance and crept up again in the 19th century. In the United States, for example, you had laws coming on the books in states in the mid 19th century outlawing abortion. they drove women to go to the ads in the back of newspapers and things,
Right.
and find snake oil salesmen, faceless people that were selling things that, were often quite dangerous. And I mean, that's what we're driving women to do now. And actually, the scary thing is, women are looking on the internet now in places like Instagram, trying to figure out how to do these botanical abortions that used to be done in the dark ages.
Yeah.
And guess what? It's very, very dangerous. We don't have the village midwife now who has, not only 20 years of personal experience, but has been handed down experience, knowledge from generations of women. We don't have that anymore. And you can really harm yourself. And it's quite dangerous to take matters into your own hands in that way. But a lot of women are desperate. We know from human history, women are going to have abortions.
Yeah,
you cannot stop them.
And a member of my family who's a brilliant young professional woman was fascinated with the show Mad Men. I don't know if you saw much of Mad Men. I watched the first 2 or 3 seasons, and then I thought, well, it's losing me. I'm not magnetized by it. But she was fascinated, and I asked her. I said, finally, you thought, is it because of what it portrays of how women lived, like when I was a child? And she said, absolutely. It's like another world. I mean, I remember there's an episode where Don Draper's wife goes to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist calls him to tell him what she's going through, her most personal secrets, and what the doctor, man to man, thinks should be done about it. That kind of thing. I fear we might be going back to that. And I guess my last comment is I was unplanned in a time when abortions were unavailable. And I've had, actually fairly friendly conversations with anti-abortion people saying, well, aren't you glad you're born? It's like, first of all, a highly hypothetical question. But secondly, no, my mother had a rough life. She was a wonderful person. If she could have had a better life, or if my not being born would have protected her from danger, from an illegal abortion, I'd like to think I'd do that, right? So it's not about hypothetical people, which is the argument they're using now. Here's your hypothetical big brother. I don't know if you've seen those memes and things. I wish I could advise you how to get through high school and all that. It's not about that. It's about something primal to me, and it's about a difference in how we relate to our essence as human beings, in a society that includes gender and reproduction. But that's my closing thought, however incoherent it may be, but I'd love to hear yours.
The other side of the hypotheticals are the studies that we now have. We know that when women are denied abortions, their existing children suffer from developmental impediments. The economic outcomes of their family suffers. We know that women die at higher rates in childbirth when in places where abortions are restricted. So we know all about it. We don't have to imagine it. We know. Right. There's data and there's proof of the bad things that are going to befall women, their families, and society as a whole if this continues. So that's my answer. To all those hypotheticals. We already know how ugly this is going to get. It's going to get very, very ugly, and not just in red states either. And it's
That's
not
interesting.
And where it is, of course, the burden falls heavily on poor women. All women are going to be impacted by this. You're a middle class woman in Lexington, Kentucky, or New Orleans or Austin. You're going to have major problems trying to manage your reproductive health. So it's sort of like it's another way for the middle class to get dragged down and penalized and made more precarious.
And I would say if you're a wealthy woman on the Upper East Side or San Francisco, wherever else, you'll also be affected by a different way that society looks at you as a woman. And
yes. I am guilty of homicide, according to many people, in power in this country right now, because I've had an abortion. That is an extremely distressing and offensive idea, to think that if I visited a particular place, I would be looked upon as a murderer. That's repugnant. It's absolutely repugnant. Yes, it is an objectification of women's bodies, a denigration of us as thinking beings making our own choices. You're absolutely right. Diminishes us.
Well, cultural history, your specialty, is one of our best weapons to resist that. So, Lynn Parramore, cultural historian and author, thanks for your great work in that area. And as always, thanks for a fascinating conversation.
And thank you for giving us the time and space to do this and the platform. Thank you very much.
You bet. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.